Good evening. My name is Simon Peacock. I'm Dean of the Faculty of Science at UBC, and it's a pleasure to be your host tonight. Thank you all for showing up tonight, and we have an exciting panel for you. Also, welcome to the Museum of Vancouver. Thank you for carving out time for your busy schedules to join us. As Dean, one of the privileges I have are opportunities like this one to put a public face on the people and the research happening at UBC Science. And I want to, as alumni, I want to catch you up on just some of the exciting things that have happened over the past few months at UBC. Some of you may have heard that UBC Professor of Physics and Astronomy Gary Hinshaw shared the $3 million Breakthrough Prize in Fundamental Physics, that Dr. Rashid Sumaila won the International Volvo Environmental Prize for his innovative work in fisheries economics and sustainable governance of ocean resources. We were delighted to announce that we've successfully recruited computer scientist Margot Seltzer from Harvard. Stole her from Harvard, I'll say, in this room. Those of you who went on to get other degrees at Harvard, I apologize in advance. She will be joining UBC as the Canada 150 Research Chair in Computer Systems and the Cheriton Family Chair in Computer Systems. Also have to note that we have a new Vice President, Research and Innovation at UBC. Her name is Gail Murphy, and I'm delighted to say that she was rose out of the ranks of the professoriate in our Department of Computer Science. So for a brief couple of years, she worked in my office. Now she gives me orders as the Vice President of Research, and it's a wonderful place to be. I'm also delighted on the undergraduate front. I'm tremendously proud that thanks to the hard work of a whole team of people, we've have 2,200 co-op placements this year for our undergraduate science students. And of course, hundreds of thousands of people have visited our attractions on campus, and others have taken our Science 101 courses in the downtown east side, and others, like yourselves, come to events like tonight. So it's been an exciting year at UBC Science, but of course we do face some challenges, and that will be the discussion of tonight. But another privilege I have as Dean is getting to recognize the accomplishments of outstanding alumni, and it truly does not get better than tonight. This year, Alumni UBC is marking its 100th year with Alumni UBC 100, a year-long celebration of the power of UBC's global alumni. And this stretches back 100 years to May 4th, 1917, when a small group of UBC's first graduates formed the Alumni UBC, which was our alumni association. It now has more than 325,000 members in over 140 countries around the world. Just 2 weeks ago, I was addressing some of those alumni in Ottawa. I have to say the weather here is a lot nicer. Why we do alumni events in Ottawa in early February, I have no idea. It was blizzard conditions. So to learn more about the Alumni UBC 100, I ask you to turn your attention to the screen, and I hope somebody can make this work. Someone can.
For the last century, from each of the places we called home, our paths converged at UBC. We worked hard, supported each other, and graduated with a sense of accomplishment. We were shaped by the knowledge and experiences we gained, and know they contributed to who we've become. As individuals, we are talented and unique, and as one, we're a powerful movement of difference makers. Knowing that we're stronger together, Alumni UBC was formed by UBC's first graduates on May 4th, 1917. Now, 100 years on, we're more than 325,000 strong, spanning over 140 countries. And when we bring our ideas, interests, and energy together, it's a beautiful thing. To mark our 100th year, we're building our community around the globe with an ambitious goal, making 100,000 connections. And there are many ways to take part. There's everything from joining one of our social media communities to attending or hosting one of 100 dinners in whatever part of the globe you live. You can also participate in an official Alumni UBC event, either in person or online. and visit the Robert H. Lee Alumni Center on our Vancouver campus, the home of UBC Alumni for Life. The first and easiest way for you to connect is to add yourself to our global alumni map at alumni.ubc.ca. It's quick and simple. So join us in celebrating this remarkable moment in our history by connecting with each other and UBC. And stay tuned for more to come.
Happy 100th birthday, Alumni UBC.
Well, as part of Alumni UBC 100, we have been giving out Alumni Builder Awards to recognize alumni who have made important contributions to the success of UBC and its alumni community. And as some of you know, I'm coming up towards the end of my tenure as Dean of the Faculty of Science, and it has given me great pleasure to work with a whole number of outstanding individuals, and it is my distinct honor to honor one of our alumni builders, and I ask you to join me in recognizing our moderator for tonight, Dr. Jennifer Gardy. Jennifer, if you join me up here.
I got a thing! Wow.
So we have a wonderful, suitable, not just suitable for framing, we went ahead and framed that.
That's amazing. Oh, you guys.
So today, Jen is being awarded an Alumni Builder Award for her many contributions to UBC and the Faculty of Science and her dedication to advancing science communications in Canada. Some of you may know Jennifer already. Some of you may recognize Jennifer from her roles on TV, but let me just say a few things about you, Jennifer. Jennifer earned her bachelor's degree in biology from UBC. She then went on to get a graduate diploma in biotechnology from McGill and a PhD in molecular biology and biochemistry from Simon Fraser University. She's currently an assistant professor in the School of Population and Public Health at UBC and holds a Canada Research Chair in Public Health Genomics. Her lab at the BC Centre for Disease Control seeks to understand the transmission and epidemiology of infectious diseases, including tuberculosis, influenza, and measles. She is a devoted science communicator, passionate about educating the public about complex scientific issues and helping them to understand the importance and the implications of scientific discovery and knowledge. She's hosted an 8-part science series for CBC television, multiple episodes of CBC's long-running documentary series, The Nature of Things, and is a regular guest host on Discovery Channel Canada's flagship science news magazine, Daily Planet. She has blogged and written for the Canadian newspaper The Globe and Mail, recently published a children's book called It's Catching, The Infectious World of Germs and Microbes, and runs a series of workshops for graduate students and postdocs on how to communicate science effectively. In 2013, she was given the Public Education about Microbiology through the Media Award from the UBC's Department of Microbiology and Immunology. In 2014, she won the YWCA Women of Distinction Award in the Science, Technology, and Research category. And in 2015, she earned the UBC President's Award for Public Education through Media, an award that celebrates the active and creative sharing of research expertise through the news media. Congratulations, Jennifer. You are an exemplar of a UBC alumni builder.
Aww. Thank you. This one means the most.
So,
Turn it over to me.
turn it over to you because
You can relax.
right,
you
now
can
need
chill.
to,
I
sing
just
for
get to
yourself.
I get to carry this around all night. You know what I'll do? I'll pop this over here. Otherwise, I feared that I might take out a panelist's eye with the sharp edges, and we wouldn't want that. Thank you so much, first of all, for the award. That's amazing. Alumni UBC and UBC itself has always meant a lot to me. When I was a kid, my dad, who graduated from UBC in the 60s, he moved out from Alberta to play for the UBC Thunderbirds football team, and my uncle followed in his footsteps. My mom did as well. She didn't play football for UBC, she just attended UBC. But my dad used to bring me out on campus every weekend when I was just a tiny little pup. He'd give me a bunch of journal articles and his photocopy card and would say, go make copies of these, I need these for work. And so I think my research in scientific scientific career was probably set in stone or set in motion then. So it's always been, a dream of mine to be part of the UBC community and now to get to give back to the next generation of students through being a faculty member. And it's really lovely to be honored with an award like that. So thank you, Simon. But now let's talk about science, because that's what we're here to talk about tonight, science and science communication. So welcome, everyone. This is me. I'll be moderating this evening. As Simon said, it was great. I don't have to introduce myself anymore. Simon kind of covered all the bases. But you heard that I do a bunch of science and a bunch of science communication. So I like to kind of describe my career path as this. If you take communication and you kind of color a little stripy timeline in red, and you take science and color a little stripy timeline in blue, because of course at science, blue is the color, or at UBC, for UBC Science. The two of them kind of existed side by side for a time. I was an undergrad at UBC doing cell biology and genetics, as Simon said, but I was working at the UBC student newspaper at the time, kind of doing communications. I didn't really see how the two fit together. Communications was something fun that you do in your spare time. Science was something you did for work. As I went on in my career, as I ended up at McGill in Montreal, I was working at the Montreal Gazette, so I was doing science in the daytime, graduate school, and then going and working in a newsroom in the evening and seeing how science stories got told, seeing how science got communicated to the public. And it was there that I started to realize that science journalism was a thing. I didn't know that science communication was a thing, but I knew that science journalism was a thing, and there were people that get paid to communicate about science. We didn't have a science reporter at the Gazette, so whenever there was a science or health story, the person that was assigned to that story would usually come into my office and say, hey, Gardy, can you explain what this means, or what's important in this story? What should I write about here? And I started doing some copy editing and fact-checking for a science magazine that had started up in Montreal at the time. When I came back to BC to start my PhD at the other university over there, I spent the kind of first year doing what you should do when you're doing a PhD, which is sort of put your nose to the grindstone and just work on your science. But as I moved forward with that, I realized that I really wanted to get back into communication. I missed this sort of exciting vibe of the newsroom. And I thought, well, I've got this newspaper experience. Maybe I can somehow sort of put that together with the science that I'm doing, maybe do a bit of freelance science journalism. So I started doing that, which was super, super fun. And as I went on with my PhD, I realized that maybe I didn't necessarily want to do a research career. I wasn't ruling it out. I wasn't entirely sure if I wanted to do that, though, for the rest of my life. So I remember sitting down with my PhD supervisor, Fiona Brinkman, who's a fantastic scientist and an even better mentor. And she said, oh, well, if you like science journalism, and I know you really like getting up there and giving talks about your work, I know you really like teaching, designing posters for conferences, have you thought about science communication as a career? And this was the first moment that I realized that science communication was really a thing. So I kind of threw myself into it for the next few years, and although I ultimately did end up pursuing the sort of traditional faculty PI research path, science communication has become such an integral part of what I do that in any given day, I'm doing a bit of scientific research and I'm doing a bit of science communication and outreach. And I've really discovered, it's clear that being a good scientist helps you become a better science communicator. When you can understand the science of the stories that you're telling, it's a lot easier to tell those stories, but I didn't really appreciate how much being a communicator would feed back and improve my science. How, when you can get out there and talk about the work that you do in a way that is clear, that is concise, that is engaging, that gets people excited about it, people listen. People want to hear about what you're doing. And when you can write a compelling narrative, it's great for getting a journal article published or getting a grant funded. So science and science communication, really, I'm at this point now where everything's just tangled up and I can't really tease them apart from each other. So today, for example, I'm doing this public outreach event with all of you tonight. I spent my morning doing typical sort of faculty PI science-y things, which is usually not actually doing science. It's mostly writing emails and going to meetings about science and hoping other people can do the science for you while you're busy with all those meetings. But I also taught. I teach at UBC a graduate course in the School of Population and Public Health. It's not anything to do with my actual research, this sort of genomic investigation of infectious disease outbreaks, but I teach a course in risk and communication in public health. How do our future public health professionals, people that have to get out there and regularly talk to the media, regularly talk to the public about important health matters, what are some of the strategies that we can use for effective science communication? So tonight's title, our event, is all about saving science in fact-free times. And I think, as you'll find out tonight, that really boils down to being better science communicators. So what I thought I'd do to kick things off before I bring our panelists up is start with some of the slides that I show in the very first class of the year that I teach, which is a little bit of data on why communicate science. So, like I said, the title of tonight is Saving Science in Fact-Free Times. It's a little bit of a kind of Chicken Little, the sky is falling title. So I want to start with some good news. Let's start with the positive first. And the positive is that scientists are trusted. And science, the level of trust, the level of public trust in scientists hasn't really waned over the last few decades. The Pew Research Center has been collecting data going back 45 years now on the public's perception of various careers, industries, things like that. And scientists and doctors have always been at the top of the list. We are the most trusted individuals out there. And that trust has remained stable over time. This is a bit of an old slide that I pulled from my deck, but the most recent report just came out, and the same trend is evident, about 40%. We're doing fantastic. We're doing much better than companies, which people kind of liked back in the 70s, have taken a nosedive. Media, sorry, Peter, not doing so well. And the story gets worse when you get into politicians and religious leaders. So science, we're doing great in terms of public trust. But when you go kind of up a tier and go beyond scientists to just science in general, the story changes a little bit. This is American data, but this here is Canadian data. This is from an annual survey that the Ontario Science Centre does, looking at Canadian attitudes towards science. And they publish their annual report every year around Science Literacy Week, which is September 17th to 23rd this year. Mark your calendars. And this is a figure from last year's results, the 2017 survey. And then when they talked to Canadians and said, can you trust science, given that it's always changing, given that there's a little bit of knowledge that's modified, and that gets modified, and that gets modified, and something's proven and later disproven, and one day a headline says this, and one day a headline says something else. And nearly a third of Canadians said that because scientific ideas are fluid, they can't necessarily be trusted. If we then look at specific issues, again, things get pretty muddy. This is a survey that Pew and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, does, where they look at public perceptions of various scientific issues, and they compare public perceptions to the perceptions of scientists, AAAS members. So they've got a couple issues here where the public perception, the blue dot, is fairly close to the scientist's perception, the yellow dot. Things like the space station has been a good investment for the US. Everybody's pretty much agreed on that. They're only separated by a 4-point difference. Childhood vaccines, such as the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, should be required. Bit of a bigger gulf, but a lot of people tend to agree with that. When you get into some of the hot button issues, though, and some that shouldn't be hot button but apparently are, the story gets a little darker. Up at the top, is it safe to eat genetically modified foods? There's a 51-point gap between the public's perception and scientists' perception. It's a 37% or 37-point gap between the two perceptions of, is the Earth getting warmer, mostly because of human activity? And here's one. You would have hoped this would have been a small gap, but no. Humans and other living things have evolved over time. Scientists were totally down with us. 98% of scientists are okay with that, and I'm pretty sure the 2% that aren't probably just clicked the button wrong. At least I hope that's what the case is. Only 65%, less than 2/3 of the American public, is down with the concept of evolution. Then you realize we're in this complicated information age as well. So we've got the fact that, the public is maybe a bit skeptical about science in general, and when it comes to particular issues, we're pretty divided. Then you throw this whole layer of social media and rapid access to information on there, and you get all sorts of stuff. Up at the top left is a little screenshot from Snopes.com. I'm sure everybody in here that has an account on Facebook or that is in regular email contact with people in their extended family has that one relative that's constantly posting weird stuff to Facebook going, hey, Justin Timberlake just said that mandatory vaccination is un-American. And then immediately people will start clicking that button and sharing it because they don't stop to think, or they don't stop to go to Snopes and say, hey, actually, this is false. This is something that is just being put out there by an untrustworthy source and is now being shared. You've got Twitter, where I'm not even going to go into that corner down there and just putting it there so we all know that it's on the table. But Elon Musk, who just asked a little while ago, why is there no Flat Mars Society? And guess who's got a verified Twitter account? The Flat Earth Society, who said, hi, Elon, thanks for the question. Unlike the Earth, Mars has been observed to be round. We hope you had a great day. And then you've got this layer of celebrity pseudoscience as well. Dr. Oz, my personal favorite, Gwyneth Paltrow and her Goop lifestyle brand. Every couple of months, Gwyneth and her crowd make the headlines for promoting some sort of quackery. The most recent one was a coffee enema, the at-home coffee enema. It can be yours for $135, marble base not included. But people think this is a legitimate bit of health technology that they can incorporate into their lives. So how do we fight against this? Well, scientific literacy is obviously what we're aiming for, a scientifically literate and engaged public. And people have talked in the past about how there's sort of multiple tiers of scientific literacy. And when it comes to that first tier, just being familiar with basic facts, you can see there's a couple areas, like the evolution one, where maybe we could be doing a bit better. But particularly here in Canada, we have a very informed public. When it comes to basic facts about science, people are doing a pretty good job. And the story is true also in the United States and a bunch of other countries. People have a generally pretty good grasp of some of the basic scientific facts. Where I think things start to fall apart is the second tier. How does science actually work? How is a study designed and carried out? What's the peer review process? How does an idea become, a theory? How does an idea become evidence? How does a story make it from a laboratory out on the Point Grey campus to the headline of the newspaper that you're reading, or the website that you're clicking on, or the evening newscast that you're watching? So that's where I think we have a little bit of trouble, is understanding really how the scientific process works. And if we have a public who doesn't understand how science works, we have a public that can't think scientifically, that can't bring that same sort of lens of critical appraisal and evidence synthesis to things. A public that when they see the, Justin Timberlake says mandatory vaccination is un-American, they'll just stop and click the share button instead of stopping to think, okay, well, where did this information come from? And what's the motivation of the person that put this information out there? I think this lofty goal of understanding how science really works, how competitive it is, the drivers for how science gets done, how we dictate, what's going to be funded, what's the trendy area. That's a whole other level of understanding. But I hope that over the next few years, maybe we'll have to do this event again in 25 years, but I hope that we'll have gone beyond this just basic fact-based literacy into having a public who really understands how science works and for whom everybody is a scientist. Anybody that can think critically about something becomes a scientist. So fortunately, there's a lot of research now into how do we get there? How do we take that next step up the pyramid? And you've got this emerging discipline of what's being called the science of science communication. And it's funny because it took scientists a really long time to discover that there's a whole body of research around communication. And so all of a sudden the scientists discovered it and they're like, let's call it the science of science communication. Whereas communication professionals would have just called it communications research. But no, we've found it now and we've labeled it, so it's our own. this is a special issue of the Proceedings of the National Academy of the Sciences, all about the science of science communication. This came out in 2013. You can find it for free online, and it's got a lot of really good information in there. But when it comes down to building scientific literacy, you can read through the entire supplement, and it really boils down to one thing, which is being better communicators, getting scientists out there into the community, interacting with the public, and sharing what it is we do and why it matters, and building an engaged public. So that is what tonight is going to be about. We have 4 absolutely amazing panelists who are going to come up and share some vignettes of how they have gone about taking their science out into the world to the public in creative ways to try and get people engaged around particular topics, whether it's plants, whether it's space. There's all sorts of things coming up. So we've got fantastic people to present to you. Julia Amrangan Madison. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Victoria. She's an ecologist who has a real passion for fusing science and art together to really sort of reach both audiences, which is absolutely fantastic. She did a master's project where she developed kind of an educational computer game involving plants and fungi, which is awesome. And she's bringing something really interesting. I'll give you a sneak preview. It's something to do with sculpture. So she'll be presenting first. I did ask all of our panelists, too, what their favorite scientific phenomenon was. And so Julia reported that her favorite is the fact that certain plants who are predated upon by specific caterpillar species, certain plants can actually recognize the sound of their specific caterpillar chewing. And then I don't know what they do. They don't run away because they're plants. They probably release some sort of angry defense signal, knowing what I do about plants and their immune system. But that's really cool. Plants have ears, and they can say, holy crap, something's eating me. Peter Klein is he's an associate professor in the UBC Graduate School of Journalism, but he's also the director of UBC's Global Reporting Center, which is an absolutely incredible initiative that brings together journalists and community members and academics to really put together incredibly cool, in-depth investigative reporting projects. He is our only Emmy Award-winning panelist. He's worked at 60 Minutes and the New York Times. And Peter had a really important early start in science. When I asked him what his scientific phenomena, or his favorite scientific moment was, he said in 7th grade he had entered a science fair with a perpetual motion machine that he was convinced was going to work, and Peter was going to save the world. Unfortunately, Gregory Kaplan's project fell on Peter's perpetual motion machine, destroying it before the science fair could take place. So we'll never know. We'll never know unless we can convince Peter to rebuild, make it stronger. Kobe Michaels is an integrated sciences student at UBC. He is also the founding editor of the UBC's science section. I'm sure you've all read the UBC newspaper, but I bet you didn't know that until Kobe came along, there was no actual sciences section. But now there is. Kobe's also done a number of other cool things, including interning for NPR in the States, and he works for UBC's Gearing Up project as an educator and a video producer. So he's out there getting kids connected with engineering. And finally, Michael Unger is the astronomy educator and program coordinator just over there and up at the H.R. McMillan Space Sciences Center. He's the panelist with the shortest commute tonight. He's also the host of Nerd Night Vancouver, one of our long-running public engagement events in this city where people are invited to come out, hear some really cool science in a bar at the Fox Cabaret. Come on Wednesday, February 21st. I'll be co-hosting with Michael. We've got talks on bioengineering, toxicology, and dietetics, nutrition, although it's actually going to be about farts and poo. So it should be really quite fascinating. Oh, I forgot to read Kobe's thing, and then I'll get into Michael's thing. Kobe's favorite little science bit is bacterial transformation, when you get viruses picking up little bits of DNA and moving them between bacteria, because it's so random and cool, and how does this thing actually work? Michael's favorite thing, he loves orbital mechanics and just understanding motion, and how you can control motion, which translates into, evidently, a fairly successful career as a recreational pinballer. So, with that, I will invite our 4 panelists up to join me on the stage. I will get the heck out of the way, come sit in our sciencey director chairs. And I'm going to turn it over to each of you. So I'm going to use this magical clicky thing, and I will first introduce you to Julia Amberongen Madison.
Okay. So this is something I made. I'm an ecologist by training, and I've always been daunted by how complex ecosystems are, that they're very unpredictable, they have nonlinear effects, there's all these things that are hard to handle. So I'll just explain what this is, and then I'll talk a bit about why I have it here today. So this is a representation of a food web, a very simple food web. Each of these baskets represents a species. So this is the sun. And then these are two plant species that are dependent on the sunlight, and they're in competition with each other. And then these are some herbivores that are all dependent on their plants. And these are some predators that are eating those herbivores. And with something like this, you can see what happens if you add more of a given species. Now, what this doesn't currently include is any mutualisms, so where there's a mutual benefit between two species. This is just a prototype. But you can imagine if there was a whole room full of a network like this with lots of baskets, and that would represent a real ecosystem a lot better than this would. Now, I made this for two reasons. One was to help me understand ecosystems better and sort of get a feel for that complexity. And the other was hopefully to communicate that to others. So I took this to a Curiosity Collider event, which is a science art group here in Vancouver, and got to talk to a bunch of ecologists and artists and other people about this mobile. And I want to bring this up because one of my favorite forms of science communication is artistic science communication, where you're doing something that is engaging the senses in a unique way. So it's visual, or it's something you can play with, or it's music. But also because it's artistic, I don't know if you'd call this art, but bear with me. But if it's artistic, or if it's under that label, you might be able to sort of engage with artistic inquiry. So the way that art looks at something and says, why did the person choose to make that way? What are the inaccuracies about? Like, this doesn't, obviously species are full of individuals that act differently. And so this is not a great representation, even if you did have lots of species. Each one of these acts like it's a unanimous group. And so you can talk about those inaccuracies as part of sort of the artistic critique. And I wanted to bring that in because I think that providing sort of tangible, physical opportunities to interact with abstract subjects, and then that different way of inquiry can be a really accessible way for the public to get at scientific content. But I just want to finish with one little caveat, which is, of course, that this is a very open-ended kind of science communication. Who knows what someone's going to get from it? And I think that it's important when thinking about science art and thinking about the topic of tonight, to pick your style of communication carefully. That if you want a really clear message to get across, this might not be the best option. But if you want sort of a critically engaged public who sort of thinks about scientific ideas in a unique way, then I think this is a cool option.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. And I love that it's stealth science communication, because that's one of the things that we have to do sometimes. Sometimes you're talking to an audience that might not be receptive about, science itself. And if you can sneak it in, it's just like giving kids vegetables. If you bake it into something, you're like, oh, little do they know this chocolate cake actually contains zucchini. It's the same kind of thing. Sometimes you have to sneak it in there. So I'll turn things over to Peter Klein now.
So I'm sort of the fraud on the panel here because I'm not a working scientist. I did come from a science background. I was a science teacher, a science and math high school teacher before I pivoted early on in my career to journalism, but I've always been interested in reporting on science, and particularly in medicine. One topic that I've reported on for many years is access to medicine and pharmaceutical patents and a whole range of sort of political issues and economic issues in medicine. something that always bothered me was specifically some of the complexities around expensive drugs for rare diseases. Some of these drugs are extremely expensive, and they may not be effective. But there's kind of a knee-jerk reaction that policymakers and public have around this. It's a very complicated issue to report on, because as soon as you trot out some poor little kid with a metabolic disorder who might die soon, it's hard to have any serious policy conversations about coverage of drugs or why drugs are priced the way they are. You just want to save this little kid. Anyway, so we started this center, as Jen mentioned, the Global Reporting Center, to bring scholars and journalists together, leading scholars, leading journalists around the world, to collaborate on projects where the scholars can bring their expert knowledge and the journalists can bring their storytelling skills and have them work together, sort of ground up on a research project, on a variety of research projects. So one of the first projects we did was with UBC Faculty of Pharmaceutical Science, Larry Lind, who studies this particular issue of expensive drugs for rare diseases and has a whole group of experts around the country in Canada who study this issue from a variety of standpoints, clinicians, pharmacoeconomists, et cetera, pharmaceutical researchers, of course. And then I brought some journalists to the table. And it's been an extremely effective project. We created a project called $1 Million Meds. We got CIHR funding, a 5-year-long research project, and we're able to really study this issue from a lot of different perspectives, bottom up and top down, through specific case studies of patients, but also kind of take it beyond those specific case studies, because as I say, once you start bringing patients into these stories from a journalist standpoint, that's the most interesting, compelling thing. And from the reader standpoint, people want to read about a heart-wrenching story, but it's very difficult to get beyond that. So we created a multimedia site where we are forced the audience to, you can only get like 2 minutes of the story, and then you have to go hear from an expert who then contextualizes what's going on. And because the public often doesn't have necessarily a kind of a scientific inquiry mindset. So if someone says a drug is expensive and it's effective, you just accept it. But it may not be effective. It may actually not be effective at all, or it may not be very effective. It may marginally extend someone's life by 1%, but it costs $1 million a year in a public health system. That may not be a very good use of public funds, which is a very difficult conversation to have. So we did this project. Jen actually was very proud. Jen handed us an award recently for that project. This project's won a couple different awards, and it's gone on now to further funding to look globally how different countries around the world deal with this issue. So just an example of how we've been able to bring different people together to explore these issues.
Fantastic, thank you, Peter. And if you guys want to check out $1 Million Meds, it's milliondollarmeds.com. I still know the URL, even though it was 2 years ago when I juried the competition that gave $1 Million Meds the award. I still remember the URL because it's that good. Go check it out tonight. Kobe Michaels is up next.
Thank you. I've always wanted to sit in one of those chairs, but they're kind of wobbly. So if you were wondering, not as exciting as I thought it would be. Yeah. So I work with Gearing Up. Gearing Up is a mostly student-led science and engineering outreach group based at UBC. And over the summer, we had the opportunity of traveling up to 2 First Nations communities in northern British Columbia, fly-in communities. And we're just going to show a quick clip from the video we produced while we were up there.
I was a dreamer. I've been a dreamer since child. The dreams of my old age now is to see our young people thrive. I think it's not only my dream, I think it's a dream of most elders of the Sikh Indian nation to see the youth do good.
We started with Gearing Up last year, and the idea was the UBC students from science and engineering would come to the community and provide some workshops with our kids in the classroom with hands-on science experiments. Last year was hugely successful, and we had a conversation afterwards about coming back this year, but then also expanding the program and doing a camp out.
It's actually really cool where we're taking Indigenous knowledge of the land, inherent knowledge that kids already have of science and technology within their own communities, and Gearing Up has come in with their knowledge of STEM and aligning the 2 different types of knowledges so that the kids recognize that they've always had science in their communities. They've always had technology, engineering, mathematics to some degree.
It'd be great to build the relationships with the university so then it's not as scary to go out. They'll have those connections there. They can go to university. It's not something that's out of reach for them.
Continuity is really important so that the kids can see that people actually do care about us. They want us to learn, they're here for us. Having that base is really important so that they know that we're not alone here, we're not in isolation. We're part of BC, we're part of Canada. We can learn the same things as those kids out there.
Continuity is huge for us. Building relationships with the students, getting to know them on a personal level, they get to know you, right? When the relationship is there, then learning can take place.
They're already excited. They're already talking about next year. They want to do this again.
I think what your company is doing, gearing up, is a very positive move, and I really appreciate you guys coming into our little wilderness community, sharing your knowledge and your ideas and your dreams with us as we ourselves with you. So thank you very much for coming to us.
So something that Clayton said, who you saw in the video, he's one of the school principals up there, that really stuck with us was that once the trust is there, once there's a relationship, then learning can take place. So it's so important in a digital age like we're living in now to still get up off your computer, get off Facebook, stop sharing great science articles, and go out and meet people, shake hands, share your passion for science, share your knowledge if you're a scientist or a science enthusiast with people in person. And something that we've found is that you can really build trust, build a relationship there, and then once those people know who you are, trust you, understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, then you can go home and sit on your computer and make a YouTube video, and people will share it, they'll watch it, and they'll learn from it. You can tweet and have a community online around that. So it's really important, even today, still today, and I think even more so today, to go out into communities, reach people who haven't had the opportunities to be exposed to science or haven't been educated the same way we have, and share your love, share your knowledge for science, and that's a really strong way of building trust and building science knowledge. Thanks.
Thank you, Kobe. That was such a good video. Go back video. There we go. Michael Unger, over to you now.
You're right, Kobe. Oh, there we go. See the very awkward chairs
first.
and very awkward microphones. Hey, everyone. Like Jen said, I do a lot of outreach with science, not only at the Space Center, but at Nerd Night. I deal with the public a lot. I'm the coordinator, not only the school coordinator, we get the field trips, had lots this morning, but also the public coordinator. I was here late last night because we had a big Valentine's night event. So I deal with the public, and I listen to a lot of questions, and that's really exciting for me because we get so many questions, wild and crazy questions, and sometimes scary questions from flat earthers. We do get them. We got flat earthers trolling us when we did a Carl Sagan event. And before we did our Carl Sagan event, I was getting questions from my directors like, why are we doing a Carl Sagan event? And then that happens like, this is why we're doing a Carl Sagan event. And so when I'm dealing with the public, there is a there's a lot of things that can happen. And the great thing about being like a public institution, a space, a planetarium, a space center, is when things happen in the news, the public come to us and media comes to us. An asteroid, hits the sky, when we didn't expect it, it just happened, and our phones are running are phoning up the hook, and people are coming and asking questions, and it's a great opportunity for us to do, asteroid meteor science right there. We didn't expect it, but it's happening. And then we have Elon Musk blasting a car into space, and it was super exciting. And for me and my fellow space enthusiasts, we were glued to our screens, and we were super excited. And the next day, I look on a Facebook, and a lot of like what I would believe to be like colleagues, not like me in the space and science field, but like people like left-leaning, we're all sort of like on the same side here, and they're posting this article that a journalist from The Guardian wrote, and the title was, Elon Musk's latest endeavor is utterly depressing. And this was a really important, moment for me, because it's a time for me to be like, I should listen to what is actually going on here, because this war that we seem to be in, this fact-free world that we're in, you have the flat earthers, you have sort of like the climate change deniers, and yeah, we are sort of like battling against them, but there is a bigger opportunity for communicating science, and that's with all of the rest of the people that need the education. And when these moments happen, we have to be ready. One story that I wanted to finish off with was one of these big moments that for any astronomy educator last year, there was one moment that was the granddaddy of them all, and that was the solar eclipse. And this solar eclipse is an amazing event. One of the reasons I chose orbital mechanics as being one of the things that I love, because everything is in motion, and the solar eclipse is just this grand moment that is going to happen at a very specific time, and you can do nothing to stop it. I mean, maybe the clouds will obscure your view, but that eclipse is going to happen at that exact moment, and we know that. And for people to witness that with their eyes is a very powerful moment. But leading up to the eclipse, I had to be here. Unfortunately, I could not go down into the path of totality, which was a bit of a sad moment for me personally, but I knew this was going to be a big opportunity for outreach and communication for the people right here in Vancouver. It was going to be a partial eclipse, but it was still going to be pretty exciting. Leading up to August 21st, there was a lot of panic because there was some fraudulent solar glasses that went onto the market. Amazon did a big recall, and then all of a sudden there was a shortage. We didn't have enough glasses for everyone. We couldn't order anymore. We had to be like, okay, we're going to have to hide our 2,000 glasses. And people were frantic because they thought, oh my God, are we going to go blind? Is my dog going to go blind? Here's this moment where it was very high stress, but we had to be calm and communicate what was actually going to happen. And then on the day of 7 a.m., we had over 8,000 people coming into Vanier Park. And when you guys leave, just imagine that many people in this area. Last night for our sold-out event, we had 230. That's as many people we can fit in the building, 230 people. We had 8,000 out there. We were not prepared for this. We had 2,000 glasses. You do the math. We did not have enough glasses. We only have a couple telescopes. It was panicky. But what happened when the moon started to move across the sun, and all of a sudden people were just in awe. And all of a sudden they became scientists in that moment. And they would look to the next person who didn't have glasses like, you have to look at this. And they were just passing the glasses along, making sure that everyone had that moment. So what I want to leave you with is that, Peter, I say that you are a scientist. If you're a critical thinker, we are all scientists. And in our everyday lives, even though we're not working in science, these moments happen with our families, with our friends, with our colleagues. We can engage in conversations when these moments happen, when these news things happen, and we can talk and we can listen as well. I don't think these conversations need to be so combative, because I think listening is also a big part of communication, especially in this day and age. Thank you.
Thank you. So it's panel time now. Stop. Panel time. I won't sing anymore, I promise. Panel time is a chance for me to ask some questions. The moderator is prerogative. I get to go first. But then we'll open the floor up and we'll do questions from all of you. And yeah, feel free to go anywhere with your questions. I'm going to start with some things that kind of jumped to mind as I was listening to each of your presentations. And anybody can jump in on these, just go nuts. That's the nice thing about not having to pass the handheld is we can just all talk at the same time and it'll be fantastic. So I'll start with Julia's presentation because I really liked how when you were explaining the mobile, the sculpture, you talked about how there's a certain amount of inaccuracy or uncertainty that you're trying to communicate in there. First of all, when you're translating science into art, you have to take a little bit of creative license and kind of leave some things. And we do that too in storytelling for film and documentary television. You have to kind of pick one thread and run with it. But yeah, there's this issue of communicating uncertainty. And that is, I think, one of the most difficult things for scientists and other communicators to get across when we don't understand an issue entirely. And I think that's what introduces some skepticism in the public. So to the entire panel, what are some of your strategies for communicating uncertainty?
I guess since I made the mobile, I like the idea that so I think a bigger mobile with more species would be better.
Always build it bigger.
To really communicate the uncertainty. But I think the other effect that I didn't really talk about that I would hope would happen is that if you played with the mobile enough, you would get to know it. And I think that's what happens with ecosystems, is that trying to learn about them in general can end up being very difficult. But once you've been in one place for a long time, you sort of get to know it. So the hope is that by having interactions with the system, you get an experiential feel for how much uncertainty there is. So not just that there is uncertainty and we have no idea what's going on, or that we're absolutely certain, but that there's a sort of known uncertainty.
Yeah. And that, I think, ties in nicely with what Kobe and Michael presented, which was sort of the land-based experiential learning and the observational learning, the participatory, like, hey, let's do this together. When you experience the system, when you're an active participant in science, you start to appreciate the subtleties, and it gets you to that stage of understanding how science works. It's not just about understanding the food web, it's about the process of understanding the food web. So.
Well, I think one of the things about uncertainty, Jen, is the stigma around the phrase "I don't know," which, when it comes down to it, is really an open door to finding some answers. And the uncertainty thing, sometimes the public, they need the answers. And they get afraid if someone who's perceived to be a public figure, like a scientist, says, "I don't know." It's like, oh my God, the scientist doesn't know. Nobody knows.
Well, we do.
But that's it. It should be an opportunity to let people know this is a process. Science is a process, and we do that a lot in our school workshops. Is getting the kids to really understand that from a young age. It can be challenging with adults that sort of grew up in a certain era that answers are important, and that's what they want from the news. That's what they want from scientists. So I think it's about sort of trying to change that understanding and being okay to say I don't know, and for scientists to feel comfortable in saying I don't know.
Yeah. You started with the hardest question, because uncertainty is really hard, and it's also like a dangerous thing to communicate, because you want to say go get your flu shot, but you also don't want to say you won't get the flu, because that's not how it works. There's a fine line between saying what science knows and then showing the uncertainty. But I think on the flip side of that, uncertainty is also the best part about science. It's the curiosity that every scientist has that makes them ask questions every day. And if you can impart that curiosity when you're educating or when you're communicating or when you're telling a story about science, that will get people invested, that will get people interested. There's a question, I remember the first time I asked a question in class and the professor was like, there is no answer to that question. I'm like, oh, well, now I want to go find it, and that makes you a scientist. And if you can give that moment to people, I think they'll invest in science. They'll start to understand, like you were explaining earlier, not only the facts, but how it works. And once you have that, there's a much deeper understanding, a much deeper appreciation.
Yeah. Well, that goes back to, Peter, you said when you were introducing yourself, oh, I'm not a scientist, and Michael called you out for it. I was going to call you out for it too, because you are a scientist. And thinking about, we are all scientists. When you are curious and you are embarking on learning about something using the scientific method, let's go out and make a hypothesis, take some observations, kind of throw a couple ideas around, see what sticks and works. That's being a scientist. And so how do you think we can, we saw in Kobe's video, these fantastic kids that were out there building boats and doing science and being curious. Where does it disappear? Where does, why did you never go back to the perpetual motion machine after Gregory Kaplan's project destroyed it? How can we, we're great at cultivating curiosity in kids, but how can we sustain that? Because I think that is something that will really, really help us achieve that next tier of science literacy.
I'll talk from the standpoint of a former teacher. I teach now, and I do teach some science as well, but at the high school level, I saw, and I know witnessed it with my own children, there's a point where science teachers, and I think to some extent communicators, want to add a certain amount of rigor, to some extent certainty, right? And math, you don't really have to have so much math in chemistry, for instance. Chemistry is what excites kids about chemistry is that you can, salt is made out of sodium and chloride, and those two things are like toxic, and yet you mix it together with salt. That's so cool. Or, you put reagents together and you see things.
Drop the sodium in the
water.
Wink,
and then
wink.
you see the things, right? So, if you kind of enter it from that and then back into the kind of analytic stuff, you can maybe pull them along. But there's a push, at least there was, I taught in Florida, sadly not too far, in Broward County, not too far from when that horrible massacre was yesterday, but there was a real push to kind of instill a certain rigor in kids, and that's where you lose a lot of them, because it's hard for them. It's challenging for a lot of them, and they're like, oh, this is too hard, I'm gonna do something else. And then they abandon it. And in the process, they abandon the curiosity, they abandon the critical thinking, all of those things that we love about science that they could still do, even if they aren't necessarily great at doing equations.
Yeah. I think you nailed it. I think I remember when I was in high school, our principal was trying to save time out of the week, and the first thing he said was, let's cut science labs, they're too long. I'm like, well, that's actual science. You can read the textbook as much as you want, you can learn all the facts, but that's not what scientists do, and that's not how they learn. So I think that as educators and as a system of education, there needs to be more hands-on learning. And I think that's something that Gearing Up and similar organizations have been trying to do. Is science is fun, and it should be fun in the classroom. You should be able to get dirty. You should be able to, go swimming after your boat or your plankton, or dig in the dirt for earthworms to see what they're doing and how they're doing. And the more hands-on learning we can do, I think the better. Because when you're a scientist, you're not sitting there reading facts and memorizing them and spitting them out on a test. You're in the lab, you're in the field, you're doing things, you're asking questions. So the more that science education can be about asking questions and learning how to ask and answer your own questions, I think the better.
Yeah, no, that's very true. It was so cool seeing this concept of land-based learning in your video, and I think, Julia, this is an area that's really relevant to the stuff that you're working on. How important is it, do you think, to get kids and adults, just get the public out there and connecting science to their everyday life in their everyday environments?
I think one of the things that I did when I was a kid, and if I look back, I did things that I loved. And the question you sort of, to tie back to your question before with can we cultivate curiosity, it can start with love. If you love doing something, you're going to be passionate about it just because you have interest in it. And you're going to figure out how this thing works. You're going to learn all the nuances just because you are self-driven. And then if then somebody may come along and they may see like, oh, that's really interesting. Can you tell me about that? And you are just going to share your pure knowledge, that pure curiosity that you have with the other person. And it starts like there with their love and finding where the passions lie with kids. And they could be all over the place. And it's, what is it about chemistry that kids love? It's hard. You have to kind of experiment a bit and let kids experiment and find those things that they're passionate about. I got into math because I read the backs of baseball cards and I figured out how to figure out averages. I didn't like math in general, but I wanted to figure out where they got that average from. It's just weird things like that. And I'm a bit of a weirdo, and so.
That's why we're friends.
So I think it can start by, encouraging kids to, and adults as well, to continue the pursuits that they love, and hoping that that sort of like spreads out to the people around them, which happens in sort of hands-on, land-based learning a lot.
Yeah, finding the science in the everyday.
Yeah.
You don't have to look that far, though. It's everywhere, and increasingly there's more and more science around us. And I think just pointing it out and saying, your phone, you can explain how your phone works. We all walk around with these devices, and most people have no idea how they work. They just work. They're just kind of this black box. But once you allow people to ask questions, you go, well, like, why does it do this thing? How can I answer that? You allow them to take it apart. It's just letting them ask those questions, encouraging those questions to be asked, and giving people the skills to go out and start answering their own questions.
I like the sculpture for that reason, because it creates a really effective entry point into a conversation like that. Because if you didn't explain that, if that was just hanging there and you were standing next to it, people would come up and go, what's that? Is that an experience that you have with that piece?
So I've only presented it once before, and in that case, yeah, I would stand next to it because that's how that event worked, and people would ask, what is this thing?
Yeah.
And I guess, sort of off Kobe's point, I think there's science all around us, and I guess one of the ways that I like to think about that is in terms of complex systems. Yeah. So in terms of that kind of system where you can have these interesting balances and tipping points, that's society, that's cities, that's classrooms, and so there's sort of that other layer of science being everywhere.
Oh, that's very cool. Yeah, it's the same sort of story, just writ on multiple levels, so you can connect it to anything. I wanted to ask one more question that sort of came to mind when, Michael, when you were talking about the article that was posted, the sort of the grumpy article. As you said just now, there's a lot of passion and love and excitement in science, but there's also a lot of grumpiness. And I think sometimes scientists get a bit of a bad public portrayal as kind of that crotchety in the lab coat. And you watch The Big Bang Theory, for example, and it's a squad of nerds. And you look at actual scientists, and I'm sure we're all self-identifying as nerds. There's not any of us that would, be angry about that label. This is a herd of nerds up here. But we don't look like what the Big Bang characters look like. We don't act like how the Big Bang characters act. So how can we maybe combat this public sort of misperception of what a scientist looks like? And we're not grumpy and talking about things that are depressing and, oh yeah, whatever, that was a terrible idea, sending things into space, and get off my lawn. How can we show that this is what science looks like? Science is friendly, excited, enthusiastic, open to everybody, and these are the faces of science. These are the faces of science.
Well, that was a big question that I've been asking myself, when I started my career here at the Space Center, and finding places of learning in non-formal settings. Because I was never one that really got excited to go into a lecture hall and listen to somebody talk about astrophysics for 3 hours. Now I kind of do, but when I was younger, not so much. So, I think about institutions like this, the Museum of Vancouver, and I do a lot of talking about how museums can be places of non-formal learning, and they don't have to be perceived as very academic. And now I started to think outside of the box again, and thinking about building what I call sort of churches of curiosity, which is why Nerd Night is such a big passion of mine, because this is taking scientists and stripping away all that veneer and putting a beer in their hand and talking to the public like you would just very casually, which is how a lot of communication happens. And there's a lot of these sort of like these non-formal bar nights that are based in scientists getting up, Café Scientifique, Creative Mornings is a great one. I just spoke there this month actually about curiosity, and they're great because they allow, and you do a great job of this, Jen, like being a real person, and you're not,
not a robot, actual human.
Yeah, and
but I mean, you're at a university, and you're not rewarded in that system for being a real person. That's extracurricular. You know, you being...
I did get the plaque.
Yeah, you did.
Missed that part.
But I mean, the point is, you know, the scientists, and it's not an indictment of, you know, the Department of Science or UBC, or it is how the university system works. You know, we want to reward rigorous research and scholarship for your peers so that you can advance your science, and that makes a lot of sense. But there's not a lot of incentive within that to communicate well. The system, I'll give it just a quick anecdote. There's a doctor named Alvin Zapersky who's was at Sick Kids 25 years ago. He was age 65, forced to retire, and he had worked on Rh disease. He helped develop and distribute the drug that essentially stopped Rh disease 50 years ago in Canada and the US and elsewhere. Rh disease is, you know, in the maternal blood type is Rh different than the fetus. So this is still a big issue in lots of parts of the world. We got some funding at the center to do a journalism project on efforts to address Rh disease, his efforts and other people's efforts to address Rh disease in places like Pakistan and Nigeria. Anyway, 50th anniversary just happened. It was at Columbia University, an event last week, and Alvin asked me, you know, I'd like to do something that raises awareness about this. And I said, listen, you write a 500 to 700 word article that's personal. It's why you did this, your passion, your narrative. I will pay for it to be translated to 5 languages, and I'll place it in newspapers around the world as kind of an op-ed. This guy's in his 80s. You know, he's lived a long time. He has incredible stories. He gave me the worst, absolute. I mean, it was just like a bullet point. It was like a PowerPoint presentation in a lecture. I was like, dude, this is terrible. So we're now rewriting it with him. Fortunately, his niece is a very good friend of mine who's a journalist and runs the DuPont Awards at Columbia University. So she's going to rewrite it for him and make it like real and in his sort of fake voice. But I mean, that's a great example. Is here's this person who's dedicated his life to particular disease and outreach, and he can't write a simple 750-word op-ed in normal parlance. It was like bullet points of stats.
Yeah. Well, that gets to the importance of story and telling science as a story. And I think, you know, what Michael was saying about these churches of curiosity are venues that are for storytelling. It's rare to find scientists that can go out there and tell a story well. But now that we're getting more and more of these venues, scientists are getting excited by the opportunity to go out and do this. It's not that hard to find people willing to volunteer to be a Nerd Night speaker. Tonight, out on campus at the BD Biodiversity Museum, there's Science Slam is happening, where you get up and do a little 5-minute kind of slam style, no slides, to talk about something you're passionate about science. So these opportunities to tell stories, I think, are sort of creeping into our scientific culture. I think they have yet to fully break through into academia, but I'm hoping that with this sort of generational shift that's happening, that more and more scientists will become better and better storytellers. And I've personally noticed, just as a faculty member at UBC, that, you know, the current demographics are we're producing far more PhDs than there are faculty positions. And we do a terrible job of training our PhD students and our postdocs to know that there's something out there besides being a PI running your own lab. So they're always following this you know, faculty position carrot at the end of the stick. And when there's a million smart people out there competing for the same positions, you know, it's not unusual for a life sciences faculty job for an assistant professor to have 600 to 800 applicants for a position. And there's a lot of very smart CVs in that pile, but the things that set the ultimately successful candidates apart from the rest of the pack are so often now those intangibles, like the storytelling ability, the ability to collaborate and network and communicate. So I'm hoping that maybe that anecdote is reflective of sort of the old school of science, where just the thinking part was the important part, but the communication piece was sort of ignored. Maybe 25 years from now I'll be proven wrong, but my fingers are crossed. My fingers are crossed.
I think a big part of that comes down to training new scientists to be better storytellers, to be better public faces of science. You know, it's something that science has been very scared of doing. You know, you were supposed to remove yourself from the science as much as possible. You weren't going to go out to a town hall meeting and introduce yourself as a scientist. You were very much going to stay on campus, do your work, and there's something called the Carl Sagan effect. So Carl Sagan spent a lot of his time as a scientist communicating. You know, he had the Cosmos, he wrote, And he was never, during his life, invited to be part of a whole bunch of scientific organizations because people, and scientists specifically, thought that his science was less rigorous because he was what they thought was dumbing it down. I would argue against that phrase. I don't think it's accurate, but he was spending time doing non-science things. Yet, if you go back and look at how many papers he published above average papers. So there needs to be not only better training of scientists and of science students to be storytellers, to be outreach, to be advocates for science, but we also need teachers, right? So there needs to be science professors and science teachers today who have those skills, and those people are unfortunately a little fewer and far between than it would be ideal. So it's important, I think, to reach out to other areas of academia and other areas of the world where people are better storytellers. So if you're a science professor, bring a journalism professor into your class. Have them, here's how you tell a story. Here's a basic story structure. It's not something that you get as a science student or as a PhD student or a master's student.
Well, the Integrated Sciences program that you're part of at UBC in the Faculty of Science is an incredibly cool program that I think is sort of training the next generation of scientists to be like that. You can create your own degree based on the aspects of science and other things that you're most interested in and sort of put things together. That's how Kobe and I met, because he wanted to combine communicable diseases and science communication. We're the only two people probably in all of British Columbia that love those two things more than anything. So it's a really fascinating program, and you can see, could we take a model like that and start getting it into high schools and elementary schools and building that science and integrating science into the rest of the curriculum in a meaningful way.
But even, I don't want to say anything. I see some integrated science people in the crowd, but I think even more importantly, you have to go sit in an English class or a film production class. Those sorts of skills that science has not valued. And I think they're starting to, and I think that's really encouraging. I think that's one of the bright spots, is that science is starting to see how important it is to tell stories. But it's important for, students to be told, yeah, you can love telling stories, you can love English class, and you can love chemistry and physics. Like, those are not mutually exclusive. So it's great to integrate science, and I think there's a lot of importance there, but we have to integrate even beyond science too. Yeah,
and instead of just talking about STEM, the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEAM, where A is for art.
And I just want to add that I was part of TerraWeb, which was a science communication program for grad students at UBC, which was a cool. We had filmmakers and journalists and stuff come and talk to us as science grad students, and it was really valuable experience. But I guess one caveat was that it was challenging to do in addition to a normal science master's. So there was certainly no expectation that we would do a smaller science master's. There was simply an expectation that we would also do a communication project. And I think that's a challenge with all of this stuff. Is it an add-on, or is it a new allocation of resources?
Yeah, and educating people, our students that are coming through as undergraduates and graduates, that is a legitimate career option too, where you don't have to be one or the other or both at the same time. You can take bits and pieces and make something new out of it. Since I don't actually have a watch on and I can't see the clock at the back of the room, if Kim's around, can you tell us how much time I still have to ask questions before we turn it over to Q&A? That's 5 minutes. So I'm going to attempt to measure 5 minutes in my head. This might go horribly wrong. Did anybody on the panel have a watch? Okay, Peter, you're the official timekeeper. I like it. Put the film producer, director who knows about timing in charge of the timing. A couple other questions. I've got quite a broad series here. I'm going to pick my favorite. This is a good one. How do you handle, when you're out there in the public talking to people, how do you handle the difficult questions or the opposing viewpoints? When the flat earther comes up and says, hey, by the way, the world is flat, not round, or when somebody comes up and goes, why? What's this about? How do you handle those situations?
Take a deep breath. Because your first reaction is probably going to be like, oh, no. Yeah. Listening as much as possible. I mean, the flat earthers are tricky to deal with because they don't want to listen.
Yeah.
they want to, they want to try to catch you, and they're trying to constantly challenge you. So, I usually in dealing with them, and thankfully it's not that much, although more than you may think. But they are still there. I mostly just sort of like smile and nod and just be like, well, you're welcome to come down and have a look through our telescope. I can certainly, look at a bunch of resources. I know you're not going to trust any of these resources I'm going to send you. Because when it comes down to it, the flat earthers specifically, they are mostly about not trusting scientists or NASA. That's their main beef, is that they think there's a grand conspiracy. In the back of my head, I think they know the Earth is round, but they just don't trust like government and science, and they think that there's something they're not privy to. So they're going to try to like needle this point. But the problem is that there are a lot of these other non-educated people that are kind of like falling into this sort of like this trap, which in its root is actually rooted in sort of observational science. Like, if I can't see it, then it's not real. Like, that's the first step of science. But you got to keep going, and find these ways to answer those questions. So. Listening, I think has been a big part. Trying not to be as combative. For me, in a public institution, it's very important because, we don't, as a space center, we don't want to be sort of like the,
grumpy scientist.
Like the grumpy scientist or the Big Bang Theory, sort of like elitist, or just kind of place. We're an educational institution, and we should act it, and we should definitely act bigger. Than trying to demean people below us. So.
Yeah, it's kind of understanding people's motivations. What's the underlying issue there? We talk about that in our risk communication class. When it comes to things like vaccine hesitancy, the main issue isn't I'm concerned about the safety of vaccines. It's I'm concerned about my child, and I want what's best for my child. So trying to find what the particular entry point around an issue might be and approaching it from that angle as opposed to the facts. Because we know that facts don't work. That's the knowledge deficit model of science communication. Time after time has been proven that you can't just give people fact after fact and expect them to arrive at the right conclusion. You can't. Peter, are there any sort of storytelling tricks or marketing tricks that you could use?
Yeah, I don't have particular marketing tricks, but I mean the vaccination is a great example, and I mean one might argue that the stakes are higher perhaps with vaccine deniers than flat earthers. And I've had a lot of conversations with vaccine deniers over the years, and I'm a very popular magnet for trolls for a lot of reasons, particularly when I write about Trump. But I've actually had some success in talking to. This actually goes back to the anthrax work that was being done. And some of during the first Gulf War, I did a lot of reporting on the health effects of the first Gulf War, depleted uranium and things like that. And a lot of people were concerned about the vaccinations that soldiers got then. This is before the fraudulent Lancet story, that kind of started that certain circles of skepticism. And of course, the fact that pharmaceutical companies don't always behave well doesn't it kind of feeds into the political underpinnings of these conspiracies. It's not just science denial. It's like, but the government is corrupt and they lie to us. Well, they are corrupt and they do lie to us. And maybe they manufactured the moonwalk. I mean, it's not that implausible once you kind of accept that they lie to us, right? So they may be lying about this. And pharmaceutical companies do all sorts of corrupt stuff. Maybe they're trying to poison us, or maybe they're trying to sell us this stuff, and they know it's bad for us. So once you start explaining, well, but it was the adjuvants that was causing this problem, and I've actually had some success in getting people to at least be open to the idea that vaccines may be valuable, and kind of look at the autism connections and the math around it. Not often, but I've actually made some progress on it. But it takes some time, and I actually have found presenting facts in not an elite way, but just sort of like kind of doling it out slowly can be useful.
A slow fact drip. Well, I'll finish with one more, and I'm going to ask each of you to answer this question. So we'll start with Julie and work our way down to Michael, which is, for people in the audience that might be interested in taking on some science communication responsibility, getting out there, talking to the public, getting engaged in this field, what advice would you offer? What's a good entry point for people just starting?
So I guess any of the sort of nerd nights, anecdotal science, I think those are, Science Slam, I think those are great places to start. They're very friendly audiences. But I guess one thing that I have found a bit daunting is that the public is this very vague thing. So I think finding opportunities within your community to start, to give a presentation if you're a scientist to your lab, or to your friends or something, have a party. I don't know, maybe that's too nerdy, but I don't think there's such thing.
Not at all.
But yeah, like start with audiences you know, and then get feedback and work from there.
There was a cute thing, it went around the internet maybe about a month ago. I know it showed up on all our Facebook feeds because some of our friends were posting about it, but it was somebody that threw a PowerPoint party, and everybody had to come prepared with a very short presentation about something they were excited about. And then everybody sat and drank wine and watched the PowerPoints about all sorts of interesting subjects, and people had a great time. So have a PowerPoint party. Peter?
Yeah, I think as a scientist entering into the notion of communication with some humility. And I don't want to generalize, but I mean, a lot of scientists feel like, well, you're an English major, like that's easy, this is hard. The truth is, I pursued science for a very, very bad reason, which was that I was much better at science and math than I was at English. And I was like, I was getting A's in all these science and math classes, I'll just continue doing that, because English, writing papers was really hard. I was getting C's in writing papers because it was just really hard to communicate. And I now see this where I work with scientists like Alvin, like lots of people who are super smart, but they just don't know how to communicate. And so if you enter into it with some humility and ask for help, and maybe partner with, if you want to write an op-ed or you want to do whatever, book or whatever you want to do, partner with someone who is a really good communicator. They may know nothing about science, but they know how to communicate. You know all the science. So you work together. You both have strengths and work together, and maybe eventually you'll, as a scientist, get good at communicating as well. So I think entering with some humility is important, because I deal with a lot of scientists at UBC helping them write op-eds, and their first draft op-eds are not
publishable.
I think a good place to start is just start consuming it. Learn what you like, learn what you don't like, learn what resonates with you and makes you excited about science. That will really inform the communication you do. If you have a huge reservoir of resources, things you like, things you didn't like that you have to pull on, you can borrow, would be the nice way to say it, but borrow from things you like from people who have a lot more experience in communication, in science communication. That's a really good place to start. The other thing I would say is you can start small. I think the number one place that you will win over people to support science, to be excited about science, to believe in science is at the dinner table. It's great to see your name up on a major newspaper or a documentary, or see those million views on YouTube or whatever it is, but a one-on-one conversation where you convince that one person to get a flu vaccine for the first time, or where you get to convince them to call their representative and say, hey, you know what, the climate is changing, we need to do something about it, that's much more powerful than something that may seem bigger and doesn't actually reach anybody. So dinner tables are a great place to start, and I think the actual most important place in the long run.
Or receptions, like the one that will take place soon. Michael.
Peter, a mentor is a really good place to start, because you need to learn from someone, and hopefully that mentor person is someone that you know. But also getting peers and a team together, because when you're first starting out, you're not going to be great at it, and you're not going to be confident in it. So you're going to fail a bit. You might have some interactions, and you're going to come away going like, oh, that was terrible. I got my ass handed to me by a flat earther, you know. And if you are really like first starting out, that's going to happen. So you need to have like a team of people to kind of like decompress and just talk about, you know, these situations, so you can go back there and keep practicing it, because you literally need to practice it. And you need to go to these informal nights, you know, like a science slam, like a Café Scientifique, or just go and participate, be in the audience, and you will find these people sitting right next to you, and you'll have conversations. And it's good to have, you know, people around you, so when you're doing science communication, you're not alone. You know, we're all out there, and you find other science communicators, they will help you, because we love doing it, and you know, that'll make you better in the long run.
Cough, cough, February 21st. Cough, cough, Fox Cabaret. Be there, be square. Let's open it up for questions from the audience. We've got a microphone. Let's go there in the brownie shirt. Yes, you're the brownie shirt.
Well, thank you very much. This was really lovely as an experience. I'm actually one of those people who just graduated and now loves science and loves communicating science, but doesn't love doing research. So this is fantastic. I think that the easiest way that we all think about to reach people is to appeal to that kind of child or that human element of curiosity and how do we solve questions, and that helps us to build a foundation kind of from the ground up to increase science literacy. How can we change the way that education works, et cetera? And what I'm curious now, Peter actually touched in this in his speech, is right now we have an opportunity to communicate science at a point where it is affecting policy. So it could be, for example, insurance policies and these expensive drugs, or public policies. We have, you know, politicians who could benefit from learning a bit of science. So how do we deal with that pragmatic aspect of maybe you don't have time to inspire a politician to love science, but you still need to communicate. So how do you do that effectively?
It's a great question, though, sort of how do you communicate to a very different audience, like the policy-making audience? Peter, do you want to tackle this one?
Yeah, it's a tough one. In the rare disease project we mentioned, we had policymakers. We actually brought them into our research project as co-investigators or collaborators, and that's one way, you know, I mean, that's sort of a very kind of elite way in a well-funded multi-million-dollar research project. You can do that in a way that, you know, sometimes it's a little more challenging. I think part of it is also, I'll say when I first got here, I moved here during the Harper years, and I had heard, you know, access to scientists is, you know, curtailed, whatever, but I didn't really understand it until I'm an American and I do mostly journalism around the world, not in Canada. I was doing a story for 60 Minutes on salmon farming, and the DFO wouldn't let me speak with scientists. And I said, what do you mean I can't speak with scientists? I'm speaking to scientists. They said, you have to have a minder. It's like, what is this, Soviet Russia? Like, no, I'm not going to have a minder when I speak to a scientist. And I was just flabbergasted that this was really going on. I'm telling you things you already know, of course, but this was very common. And what really, really upset me was the lack of public outrage. I was like, we are living in a police state when journalists can't speak to scientists unfettered. You know, there should be pickets on the street.
We were mad.
Yeah, yeah. And of course now we see the same thing happening in the States, and people are just accepting it, right? So I think it's partly the public's responsibility to stand up and support those scientists, because they're working for us, they're working for the public. And if they're not allowed to communicate their research, I mean, that seems to be the first fundamental principle as far as I'm concerned.
And I think you can start a lot smaller. Like, who here has been to a town hall meeting or a city hall meeting where you can give public comment? Okay, that's pretty good. That's more than I expected. You can go and say, hey, I'm a scientist. If you have questions about my field of science, call me. Here's my number. Or, you know, we're talking about this thing that people don't realize is related to science. Here's my view as a scientist. You can start small, whether it's going into a kid's classroom saying, hey, I'm a scientist, this is what I do, or going to a town hall meeting where, you know, maybe science isn't discussed, and just saying, I'm a scientist, I'm here to help, let's work through this scientifically. You can start much smaller, and that's a powerful way of affecting change too.
Kobe and Michael and I do a lot of training of other folks on how to communicate science. And one of the first things we always tell people is you have to understand your audience. You have to know who you're speaking to and what their motivations are. And at BCCDC, we do a lot of policy briefings. We do research that directly informs public health policy and practice. And policymakers, they're all about the bottom line. You know, they don't care about the curiosity, the emotion, the values. They're like, what does this mean for my government? What does this mean for my budget? Tell me everything that I need to know in 3 bullet points. So it's kind of stopping to think like, okay, who am I communicating to? What do they need to do with this information? Let me package it in a way that works for them. There was another question over there. Let's go there in the black zippy jacket. I'm going to call everybody out by fashion choices this evening.
So there's a newspaper back in the UK called the Daily Mail, and their website, their website's one of the most visited websites in the world after Google, YouTube, Wikipedia, and Facebook. So it's a pretty big deal. Anyway, they've published a lot of articles in the past on things that give you cancer, but also things that prevent cancer. And some very funny people on Facebook created 2 lists, the Daily Mail list of things that give you cancer and the Daily Mail list of things that prevent cancer. And you look at these 2 lists and they're the same list. Who knew? But you look into these articles and you read them, and there's a shred of truth there. There are studies that have been done in laboratories and with mice. And there's all sorts of things. There's chicken, there's pork, there's beef, there's all sorts of stuff. And they all give these mice cancer, which starts to make you wonder if mice are just like predisposed to cancer. But it also raises the question, so these journalists are obviously trained in their field, as you are, Peter. And do you not think that there's some degree of responsibility that lies with the scientific community to kind of manage this relationship with the media and ensure that things that aren't slightly true the things that are slightly true don't get sort of wrongly displayed and interpreted as entirely true? And what can be done and should be done about that?
Ooh, can I do this one? That's the hard part about being the panel moderator. Is like, yes, okay, panel, you take this question, but sometimes you just want to be like, me, because this is something we talk a lot about in my class. It's very, very true. And it harkens back to that thing that I showed at the beginning, which is that the public, we're pretty good with basic science facts. We're not yet as good about understanding how science works. And we're really bad at understanding how science really works. So when it comes to how science works, oftentimes you'll get a study that will say one thing, and then you'll get a study that's seemingly contradictory, but they have 2 very different underlying systems. This one did it in this type of mouse, and this other one did it in this type of mouse. This one gave the mouse 5 beers, and this one gave the mouse 25 beers. So understanding those subtle differences and how they can result in very different outputs. But then that level of how science really works, I think if people understood the pressure that scientists were under to, I don't want to say sensationalize, but to put a little bit of sizzle on their work. So if you want to do research, you got to go out and get it funded by a granting agency, and you have to write a lay summary that catches the funder's eye, that says like, wow, this is really amazing work, and it's going to lead to such and such cancer breakthrough. So right at the moment that you've conceived of the science, but you haven't started doing it yet, you're already being told to kind of hype it up a little bit. And then, hopefully you get your grant, you go and you find something interesting, you give the mice the beers, the mice get cancer, and you're like, okay, here's a headline. And so you publish your journal article, and then either the journal or the PR department at your university or in your department or school will come up with a press release. And at that stage, their job as the communications professional is to try and get attention to your work and get some headlines. So they're going to add an extra layer of hype and sizzle on top of that. Then it gets out there to the news media, and I think as scientists, we don't really understand how the media works. So if you were in the newsroom at the Montreal Gazette, where I used to work, you'd find that there's the reporter that writes the story, they turn it in, there's a separate editor who puts it on the page and writes the headline for it, and they're working under a pretty tight deadline. They got to get this paper done and printed, so they might read the first paragraph of the story and come up with a headline. So it's then lost another layer of meaning, but it's also gotten sensationalized. So the further along the knowledge chain it goes, the less of the original science is included and the more hype icing is being kind of spread atop the science cake. So I think as scientists, Tim Caulfield, who's an amazing guy at the University of Alberta, he's kind of a health policy and law scholar, writes a lot about celebrity pseudoscience and things like that. He talks a lot about how it's us as scientists' responsibility to try and stop that hype machine at every opportunity we have. And there was a great Twitter conversation just this last week on scientists working with the media. We shared it on our little Slack channel that we all use to chat to each other. It was about how scientists really need to calibrate their expectations of working with the media, what it's really like, and there needs to be kind of a back and forth dialogue. Did you guys want to jump on that at all, Peter?
I was going to say, hype is like mercury in the ocean, and as it sort of goes up the food chain, it gets magnified, and then, you know, we're the tuna. So
you could sculpt that.
You could.
The only thing I would add is that Ben Goldacre is a doctor and a columnist, I think, for The Guardian in the UK, and he's often on Daily Mail's. Yeah, he doesn't like them. Let's put it that way. He has a book called Bad Science, and one of the chapters is a kind of a case study of how the Lancet MMR article got picked up by the UK media and how scientists refused every step of the way to step in. They said, oh, this is so wrong, we're not even going to touch it. So I think scientists need to realize that they have a responsibility that if they see something wrong, that they can say something, and that even if they know it's obviously wrong, the public might not, and there needs to be a level of responsibility there for scientists willing to say, this is not right, this is the wrong headline, this is the wrong reporting, and to kind of have that courage to speak up and speak out.
We've got time for one more question, apparently. Let's go to this side of the room, just because we did that side of the room first. Right there at the back. And then there will be plenty of time for one-on-one questions afterwards over ethanol and other things.
This is about humility, and whenever I hear that that scientists are in full consensus on whatever, I think about the fact that until the middle of the night, or sometime in the 19th century, I'm not sure when, ether existed, and it was fundamental to science, and there was absolute consensus on that. And I think every single thing needs to be taken with a grain of salt every single time.
That's what is really exciting, I find. You know, we can look back and look at a time, you know, when the Earth was the center of the solar system, and there was a great challenge that people like Galileo had to fight for, and that will continue to happen. And where we could be in that time now, we could make a discovery that's going to change everything that we know. But it's back to sort of like getting people to understand that science is a process and will continue to evolve. What we know now may not be what we know in the future, and that's okay. That can actually be exciting. It can't be like scary for that to happen. Of course, if it comes to some major things with our health, you know, it'll be challenging for scientists to communicate what's actually happening here, especially if it's something where, you know, you have a big shift of like a majority of scientists that did believe something, and then all of a sudden, no, that's all wrong. So, you know, from an educational standpoint, I try to tell those stories that this has always happened and will continue to happen, and it's okay for it to happen.
And that's why UBC Science exists, because somebody's got to be here to investigate those next questions. So with that, I'll invite Simon to come up and do a couple closing remarks. We'll just stay here so we don't fall out of our chairs, because it's dangerous and scary.
Thank you very much for a stimulating discussion. I feel obligated as the Dean of the Faculty of Science to say that the concerns that we're not, you know, doing enough of this in universities is changing. Not fast enough. Universities are slow to evolve, but they do evolve. And I would point to you know, some of the people on the panel here, two of whom are faculty at UBC, and so they're out here tonight doing things. I also take to heart your point about, you know, TerraReb. It's just an add-on, and universities are terrible for just adding on more things to a degree, and we need to prune back other stuff to make room for science communication. I'm pleased to say there's a couple of specializations in science, so we do just that, and that science communication is a core part of what we're doing. So also fascinating, my limited experiences with the media, and I need to take your class, Jennifer.
You're welcome anytime. It's reading week next week, but March 1st.
March
Behavior
1st,
change
okay.
frameworks.
So please join me in thanking the panel here for a stimulating conversation tonight. And before I release you to how science is really done, which is usually with a drink in one hand, well, at least I'm a geologist, and that's how geologists interact. I want to invite everyone here to stay connected with your alma mater. There's a number of easy ways to do just that. You can continue to come to UBC science events like this. You can read Science Connect online. If you're not getting that e-magazine, please let us know your email address and we'll get it to you. And of course, feel free to drop by the Vancouver campus. Faculty of Science there has some wonderful venues. We have the Botanical Gardens. We have the BD Biodiversity Museum that we heard about earlier. We have, of course, your Alumni Center as a gateway to the campus. So please do come back, and I invite everyone to come to the reception, share a glass of wine, and interact with our specialists, people who are out there making a difference in science communication. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.